Hey, been a little while since I made a video. Hopefully the volume will be okay. This is going to be a history video, and I want to just share my reflections on a very taboo subject. And I take no pleasure from talking about this, but I think it is very important to get out there. And I want to talk about communism and why I feel that communism is just as hideous as fascism. Now, before anyone gets the wrong idea about me, I consider fascism to be grotesque, stomach churning, and evil. Goes without saying. But I think that in large part because of the dynamics of World War II, that is to say that the Soviet Union was an allied country, an allied power, and obviously the allied powers were fighting Nazi Germany on the European theatre of the war, that is, and other theatres. Understandably, fascism, Nazi Germany, and to a lesser extent fascist Italy, is remembered as the darkest enemy of civilization in Western democracies for a large part. I would argue even today, fascism is a bigger stigma than communism. And this is curious. Curious because if you look at the history of both ideologies, they are as bad as each other, really. And in terms of actual numbers, it's it's a fact that communism killed more people. Now, fascism, if we look at a timeline, let's say from the rise of Mussolini in Italy in the early 20s to the defeat of Nazi Germany, to the defeat of the Hitler regime in 1945, that's a period of roughly 25 years. And of course, there were many pseudo fascist and far right regimes around the world in the post war years, Pinochet's Chile, among other such regimes. Um, but I would argue it was a considerably briefer period than communism. Doesn't make it any less evil. That was a wicked ideology that had to be defeated, and it's a good thing that it was. And I would add that millions of Soviet civilians and soldiers gave their lives in that struggle, along with um, millions of others, of course. I don't think we should ever forget the Soviet sacrifice. It was unthinkable numbers. It's estimated 8.7 million Soviet troops and around at least 8 million Soviet civilians. I don't think that should ever be forgotten. It's the biggest sacrifice in war of any nation in human history in fighting another nation. Um, so the history of the most well-known fascist regimes, that is Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, was relatively brief to the history of communism. If we pinpoint that, then we're talking 1917 to 1991, really, i.e., from the Russian revolutions of 1917. This year marks the centenary to the fall of communism, this European communism in 1991. Of course, the situation in China has continued, although China today is a hybrid system. Um, but I do think that there is still less of a stigma around communism in Western democracies. That's not to say that most people are blasé about it. Most people do support communism and they would consider it a totalitarian ideology, which is what it is. But you see the left taking an attitude to this that the right would absolutely not get away with if it was the equivalent with Nazism. But I find most conservatives, whatever you think of the Conservative Party, they would never ever endorse Nazism in the same way the left endorse communism or downplay communism. And I'm getting a little bit sick and tired, quite honestly, of socialists saying, oh, but we're not communists. Oh, but then they go on to defend communism. And this is not, I'm not talking about some fringe figures. These are people, Seamus Milne. I might talk about this more later on. Came across an interview with Jeremy Corbyn in GQ, and I'll talk more about that later. I'll save that for another video. But I think there's some very troubling things emerging from that, and I'll get more into that later on. But I've been reading this book for a number of years. It's a very famous biography, Mao, the Unknown Story by Yung Chang and John Halliday. It was written about 10 years ago, just over 10 years ago. It's quite a famous book, and it's one of the most exhaustively researched biographies of a famous leader ever made. 10 years of research, countless interviews with world leaders. Of course, it's not without its critics. A book like that is always going to have critics. But basically, it goes through Mao's life in terms of periods, in terms of time. And I'm reading up to the point now in the later stages of the Chinese Civil War in the late 1940s. This was just before the communist victory in 1949. And what's shocking is communist atrocities were happening in China before 1949. Mao's excesses are well known to those of us who despise communism, but we associate those with the Cultural Revolution of the 60s and the Great Leap Forward of the late 50s, early 60s. But what's shocking is communist brutality was going on long before the communist victory in 1949. It was going on throughout the Civil War. Now, it's not that the nationalists were much better. The Kuomintang committed atrocities as well, there's no question about it. Like all civil wars, it was a brutal, brutal war. But I'm reading about the Siege of Changchun. It's a big industrial city in northern China in 1948, the latter stages of the Chinese Civil War. By some accounts, more people died in Changchun than during the most notorious of the Japanese war crimes at Nanking. But in China, what do you think gets more attention? Well, take a guess. Um, but the brutality that went on in Changchun was shocking. Mao, as became a hallmark of his regime, didn't care about the number of civilian deaths. All he cared about it was it being a communist victory. He refused to let refugees flee the city. And when the communists took control of Changchun, as per this book, um, the excesses were horrendous. And it was basically echoed later on in the Cultural Revolution. Um, the civilian population was brutalized by Mao's henchmen, a particular sadist thug by the name of Kang Sheng. And I'm talking about some really hideous atrocities. Children were taught to inform on other children who were the supposed sons and daughters of landowners. But unlike Russia, these so-called landowners and landlords were not super rich people. They were people who may have been moderately better off. Let me just read out an extract. Mao regarded this process of terrorization as indispensable for winning the war. So when he was preparing for the last decisive campaign, Huahai, that's one of the offensives, he sent Kang Sheng to Shandong province, which was going to bear most of the logistics burden to carry out a second land reform at the end of 1947, having decided that the first had not been fearsome enough. Kang decreed hideous public torture and executions on a scale so large that the Shandong party organization revolted. It was purged en masse. A sense of the scale of the violence can be derived from the fact that in one small town, where relations had been good up until then, 120 people were beaten to death. Some simply designated as landlord sympathizers. Among them were two boys, aged 7, who were killed by children in the Children's Corps. It was this generalized terror in Shandong that built the foundation for the Huahai victory. And I'm not going to read out all the extracts here, but well-known book, Mao, The Unknown Story, Yung Chang and John Halliday. But even if you disregard that book and say it's biased, there are numerous accounts of the excesses of Mao's China. And even before 1949, that's what's shocking. Before 1949. So, whilst the nationalists were certainly brutal as well, the excesses of the communists were hideous. And because the Communist Party is still in power in China, it's very easy for them to focus on Japanese war crimes, which is undeniable. The Japanese done evil things in China, no question about that. But I do think they use it as a distraction from their own crimes. And I really think that, frankly, it infuriates me when I see the sort of downplaying of communist atrocities, not just China, Stalin's Russia, Castro's Cuba. The list goes on. Communism, arguably, is the most blood drenched ideology ever. 100 million deaths at least in the 20th century. If we look at fascism, let's look at Holocaust deaths. The Jewish Shoah, 6 million deaths, and other atrocities from Soviet prisoners of war killed, homosexuals, Slavs, communists, and others. It's estimated maybe 12 million victims of Hitler's regime. But if we look at Mussolini's Italy, Pinochet's Chile, certainly the number of deaths from fascism do go into the millions. One of the things that Western communist apologists always come out with is, oh, but what about imperialism? What about British imperialism, French imperialism, American imperialism? The utter hypocrisy of this is infuriating because they totally ignore Soviet imperialism. Because the Soviet Empire was basically imperialist. Look at the way that Russia, as the dominant country, I mean, look at the way the Soviet Union invaded a sovereign nation, Afghanistan, causing basically the endless problems we've seen since then in 1978. Um, Look at the dominance of the Central Asian republics, particularly by Russia. It was an imperialist system. So, whilst they may have been throwing over the old Tsarist system, it ended up imperialist in its own right, as Reagan called it the evil empire. He was right. It was an evil empire. I mean, put it this way, how many people tried to get from the West into East Berlin? Very, very few. To me, that is telling. And I am of the conviction that communism, at least in practice, was evil. Unlike some conservatives, for me, the issue wasn't opposition to the economic ideals of communism, although I think that's unrealistic. For me, it was the totalitarianism of it, the brutality of it, the cruelty of it. And I must admit, I find it very hard to keep patient with Western communist apologists, people who enjoy freedom of speech, people who live in democratic systems, and yet they go out of their way to defend these totalitarian regimes where opponents were brutally crushed, whether it be Stalin's Russia, Mao's China, Castro's Cuba. Um, the blood spilt by communist ideologies goes off the charts. As far as I'm concerned, the only real difference between communism and fascism is communism didn't have that racial component. That was far less of an issue in communist systems. But in terms of being systems that turned society against itself, in terms of being systems that relied on mass purges, in terms of being systems that involve personality cults and dictators with an iron fist, yeah, I see really little moral difference. And yet, communism, at least in Britain and I would argue in Europe, seems to get a pass that fascism doesn't. Why is that? I've heard lefties basically talking about communism like it's a normal thing. I overheard someone the other day saying, and the guy was a member of the Green Party, and he was saying, "Oh yeah, I've spoken to that person. They're a communist." Well, that's that. Imagine, or let me put it another way, and I might maybe mention this more in the Corbyn video, but imagine if Theresa May had an advisor who was a well-known fascist. She would be out of office tomorrow, and rightly so. Jeremy Corbyn has a communist sympathiser as an advisor. Now, to me, that is deeply disturbing. A Stalin apologist, Seamus Milne. He's actually said that Stalin's crimes have been inflated, and there's been too much of a focus on Stalin's crimes. I would argue quite the reverse. There's been far more films made about Hitler and about Hitler's crimes than about Stalin's crimes. And I'm not criticizing that, by the way. I think it's important to document Hitler's crimes. But I find it stomach churning that it's one thing when you get people who have grown up in a communist system where from a very early age they are subjected to an education system which is only showing one side. But when you get people in Western countries where there is far more freedom of conscience, where you can pretty much believe in whatever you want and you're not going to go to prison for it so long as you don't commit hate crime. For people to actually go out of the way to, I've heard people defend, and maybe I'm going a bit off on a tangent here, but when I hear North Korea apologists, I just find it staggering. People who say it's all Western propaganda. The thing here is you don't need to be a conservative to see that communism was evil. Evil in terms of its cruelties, in terms of its dishonesty, its manipulation, and its brutality of turning society against itself. I mean, the things that went on in Mao's China, stomach churning. And the scary thing is, or the staggering thing is, even today, it really, really isn't. It's still exonerated. Why? Because the Chinese Communist Party is still in power. That's why. I noticed that this year in Russia, there has been very muted commemorations about the 1917 revolutions. That's because, of course, communism collapsed in Russia. Now, I'm no fan of the Putin regime, but at least in Russia, they're a bit more honest about Stalin than China is about Mao. So there is a difference. And there has been some recognition of communist crimes. For example, I believe in 2010, the Russian government recognized that the Katyn massacre of 1940, carried out by NKVD personnel, 22,000 Polish officers, was a war crime, and they recognized that it was the Soviet system that done that. I'm not saying there isn't denials in Russia, but the point is it's had a political change that China hasn't had. Anyway, I'm going to round this up. But the reason I'm making this, I want to make the point that let's not kid ourselves by thinking communism somehow morally superior to fascism. They're both as bad as each other. And communism actually killed more people. It lasted longer and it killed more people. Um, it's it's a great thing, and it is one of the great hallmarks of human progress that fascism was defeated in 1945. And paradoxically, it was Stalin's Russia that helped to do that. But the crimes of communism for too long have been seconded to the crimes of fascism. And I don't think that's right. And I find it rather infuriating when I hear people who enjoy all the benefits of a democracy praising communism. I'm not saying you have. I mean, it's one thing criticizing capitalism. I have no problem with that because to me, democracy isn't about being, slavishly pro-capitalism. I don't think that's. I really would challenge that idea, which some conservatives would argue that to be pro-democracy, you have to be pro-capitalism or slavishly. I don't agree with that. There's things I don't like about neo-capitalism, but the left for too long have downplayed communism. For too long, they've turned a blind eye to it, its successes. I mean, not far from where I live, the Durham Miners Gala. I've been to that once or twice for various reasons, and they've actually got banners of Lenin. The point is, communist crimes began from the start, way back, even before Stalin, in Lenin's regime. Anyway, I'm going to round this up. I don't want to make it too long. Thanks for watching. And if you're going to come on here and tell me I'm wrong about communism, don't waste your time. This is a matter of conviction and nothing to any communist apologists out there. You've got nothing. You're clinging on to a failed ideology. I mean, think about it. How many countries in the world today really are practicing communism? China's a hybrid system. Vietnam's arguably a hybrid system. Venezuela is pushing towards that and it's becoming a failed state. A few other examples, Laos, I believe. But really, we're talking about a very small number. I believe it's 5 or 6 at the most out of 200 countries. Communism is a failed ideology, and it's an ideology that is drenched in blood. And in the case of China, in massive industrial scale dishonesty. And one day, hopefully in my lifetime, there will be some sort of turnaround in China. I'm not so naive to think that China is going to get Western style democracy overnight. Maybe it never will, but what I would like to see is the truth, the truth given to the Chinese people about just how evil communism has been in that country and just the extent of the crimes. Today, this book is banned in China. One day, hopefully, this will be available. Whatever flaws it might have, it's an alternative version of history that the Communist Party doesn't want people to know, and it's just a crime of against liberty because it goes against human knowledge. Right, I'll leave it there. Like I say, if you're a pro-communist, don't waste your time. I'm not going to censor your comment, but don't try to get me to see your way of thinking because I've got conviction on this. I believe communism's evil. De facto communism in terms of what it done in the 20th century. From communist Russia to communist China to the Red Terror in Ethiopia to the regimes of Eastern Europe, Ceausescu's Romania, um, Castro's Cuba. Yeah, the crimes of communism are vast.